So, DJ, you kind of made your own job title because you were one of the people, along with Jeff Hammerbacher, who first came up with the term data scientist. Can you tell us a little bit about how that happened?
Yeah, I'll give you kind of the quick version. This was a time when LinkedIn and Facebook were getting ready to IPO and kind of growing massively. And so HR came to us and said, you guys have all these titles, research scientist, analyst, BI engineer. You guys got to have one title. And so we often sat down regularly to trade notes, which is something people often think, well, that's weird, competitors should be trading notes. And we went through there and we compared, and we're like, analyst, to Wall Street, research scientist, to academic, and then the last thing on the list was data scientist. It's kind of duplicative. But we were LinkedIn, so what we did is we literally put out all the job postings with all the various job titles and just substituted them. So we had all of them out there, and everyone who applied that we really had the right type of DNA, this curiosity, this passion for data, they all applied to the data scientist one. And so we literally tested our way into our own job title.
That's pretty cool because it illustrates something about what that core of data science is actually discovery and using data for discovery. So what does it mean for government in general, and in your case for the White House in particular, to have a data scientist?
Well, I think one of the things that's been fascinating is if we look through the arc of the history of the government, there's been data scientists forever. I mean, George Washington was in many ways a data scientist because he had to be so vested in cartography to understand just the battlefield as well as how to think about the country. We have the census, we have all these things. What's new is how do we actually take and bring this data together across the federal government, open it back up and put it out there in the public, and then allow people to build with it, to build novel new things. One of the things that's been talked about here at Code for America is the college scorecard, taking all the data that sits inside the federal government and putting it back out in a highly digestible form so people can make better decisions about where to go to school and all the cost estimates. That requires a different approach of not just the economists and the statisticians, but us to think about how are we going to put data out there so people can build with it. We're creating a palette.
Right, but there's something super important there. I think the open data movement originally went wrong when it was simply saying, well, we'll put out all the data and people will figure out what to do with it. In the case of that college scorecard, somebody had a plausible hypothesis that there was useful data that could drive a particular purpose. To get people to make better college choices, and in fact, so the data is used, for a function. How do you get people to think correctly about how to use data more effectively, rather than just, well, we'll open it up and somebody will figure it out?
Right. So you're raising a super important point, because every time we have taken data and said, look, go to town with it, without a mission, it's very hard for people to know what to do. We have 100 people that are going to die today on our highways, traffic fatalities. We're going to have another 100 tomorrow, and those rates are going up. Why? We have no real good understanding, but if we tell the country, we have a problem here, we don't know how to solve it, we need your help to specifically solve it, then we see new ways that we could open up the data for people to actually combine it with other data sets to get an assessment. The trick to getting that conversation to happen is first for the data scientist to be in the room. When the problem is being first discussed, what happens is somebody says, well, have you thought about using the data this way? And oftentimes people say, you can do that with the data? No idea.
Yeah, that data set actually might shed light on this problem. I never thought of it that way.
That's right. So a perfect example of this was around the hurricanes recently. And one of the questions is how many people have evacuated? So what's a data scientist answer to this problem? Well, one of the answers that was posed was, well, couldn't we just get an assessment from the cellular towers about what the ratio is of how many kilobytes are flowing through the towers, just to get a sense of a back of the envelope calculation? that's just a couple quick phone calls. You're not actually collecting any real meaningful data, but you're getting a very fast approximation that helps you decide how to think about deploying resources. But that only happens when the data scientist is in the room and said, excuse me. And the other thing that's there is people have to know how to call on that person and think of it as not some kind of weird kind of answer from left field. When they value that, the dynamics changes dramatically.
That's a really good insight. It echoes something that I heard once from Jeremy Howard, who at the time was the chief scientist at data scientist at Kaggle, which runs data science competitions, and he now runs a machine learning for a healthcare company. But I asked Jeremy, what is it that the winners of the Kaggle competitions know that other people don't know? And he said, oh, nothing. He said they're all using the same algorithms. The ones who win are more creative in thinking about what data to bring to the problem.
Yeah.
And that's very much what you're talking about. Like, how do you think about, given this set of techniques, what data may be relevant to help solve a particular problem? But you have to have that meeting of data and problem.
It's always struck me, and this is I'd actually be curious your opinion on this, is in all the things that sort of we gravitate to is say, wow, I can't believe someone figured that out. They're oftentimes not a smart solution, but they're a clever solution. And so the thing that we often emphasizing people, we say clever beats smart 9 times out of 10. You need the smart solution when you need to scale it. When you need scale, now you got to bring lots of that. But getting to the target is an aspect of creativity and being clever.
Yeah, the quick and dirty improvisational use of data. So in order to be good at that, you actually need to become facile, not just with technology, but with knowing what kinds of signal is out there. How do you do that? Let's just sort of imagine that, obviously one way is you bring in someone like yourself who already has those skills, can bring in other people, and that's really one of the themes throughout here is how do we bring the expertise into government. But still, you're there. How do you get better at understanding what you've got and how it can be applied? What kind of training, what kind of capability does government need? Do they just have to go hire a data scientist, or is there something else?
I think the biggest thing is we have to build people with context. And I think one of the things that we saw that was very powerful throughout the session is if you look at the level of just a data scientist coming from the policing side of the problem or the criminal justice side of the problem without any of this context of really spending time with officers or spending time with people who are trying to clear their criminal record, when you listen and you hear the problem, it gives you a much better sense of, I wonder if the data could help us here. I wonder if it becomes a problem in which we are doing the equivalent of product building, but our weapon of choice is data. And that aspect, like through our criminal justice initiatives, police data initiative, which applies transparency, or data-driven justice, which allows people to think about how do we get people who are going into the criminal justice system, the jails, into the right mental health institutions or drug treatments without costing cities a crazy amount of money. Those all originated because we literally spent a ridiculous amount of time with people.
Well, it's interesting because it really highlights a theme that we've been hearing through this event, which is you got to get the right people in the room where it happens.
Right.
So, those right people include policymakers, because they've been the ones who've been holding the reins for a long time, but it also involves technologists, including data scientists, and then it also, most importantly, includes actual users.
That's right.
Who have to be there either in person or at least by proxy, as we've seen by just the use of, for example, video and testimonials. But
right.
Anybody else that we're missing who should be in the room where it happens?
Let me make it actually really concrete, because I give you a case where this has been a radical shift. And I think we need to figure out how to drive this shift across every single thing we do, and especially local government. The president announced the Precision Medicine Initiative to really help us enter tailored medical treatments. One of the seminal things was to say the patient, the participant, the caregiver must be at the table as an equal in the whole process. And when that first came about, the rest of the community said, whoa, wait, we usually have a group that advocates on behalf of this people. I said, no, they're going to be at the table this time. And that changed the dynamic dramatically of what we think about what is patients' access to data, what is the responsibility to make sure that they are included in the whole process. All of that, the tenor becomes much more real. And you're talking to an underserved population, suddenly you get the realization that we all should own up to is that we have done some very horrible things to those populations on the behalf of so-called medical science. And when we confront those, we're able to then have the constructive dialogue about how are we going to do this in a responsible manner.
That's a really good point, that having an advocate who represents the user is not the same as having the user in the room.
That's right.
I think that's a really
Dennis
valuable
McDonough,
point.
the President's Chief of Staff, and we have a whole avenue that's called the Technology Policy Council, what we call TPTF, Technology Policy kind of group that kind of gets together around all these equities of the White House. And that group, there's a powerful thing when you say in that meeting, as you can do at the White House, like this is the meeting, there is no other meeting. Mm-hmm. When you're in that meeting and you have to talk about the equities of what does it mean to engage and to make sure that all the communities are engaged and represented, unless those people are there, it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. That's why diversity of teams is so critical. Mm-hmm. And it's, I think, one of the testaments of what you see here at Code for America, all these teams, as well as the federal government, these are some of the most diverse teams in the country. Mm-hmm. You know, we'd look at across the rest of the tech sector, if all tech companies and everybody looked like we do out here, we'd be building a heck of a lot better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want to move on to another topic that's wrapped up in this term data scientist, which is this investigative aspect. When we think about data-driven policy, I think this came up in a conversation the other day. Often we think, oh, there's a whole lot of data which tells us that this ought to be the policy. And what came out in the conversation is, no, actually, we may have no data when we start out with the policy. We have a policy that will help us uncover data, and that says something about how policy needs to be adaptive and learning through the process, rather than, oh, well, we collected all the data and then we just kind of figured it out. It's more like, this is an experiment which we may or may not get right. And I think I've seen that, again, this is just my reading and other people may disagree, in, for example, the recent guidance on self-driving cars, where it kind of laid out a framework for discovery of, here are the things, here are the outcomes we need to achieve in terms of safety, and here are the domains in which we need this to be proven. And here's the process by which this is going to be discovered. And I went, oh my gosh, if all policymaking worked like that, as a series of experiments, and till we get to the actual ultimate policy where we go, okay, we think we know what works. So how far are we from that?
Well,
and how did you get that one right?
Karl Popper. So for those that don't know, there's a philosopher, a very famous philosopher, Karl Popper, outlines the principles of the scientific process.
Yeah.
And if you
wonderful.
If you just follow Popperian philosophy, it's pretty well laid out, which is make it testable.
Yeah.
Make it a framework and allow yourself to be led to different, more exciting conclusions and results as you evaluate.
Yeah. And that really does mean that you actually have to start with a hypothesis.
That's right.
And I think so much policy, was just, it's not really designed in such a way that somebody says, here's what we're trying to solve for.
That's right. And that way, you and I can have very different political leanings, and still we can have a theory of the case.
Yeah.
And we can make the theory of the case testable.
Yeah.
And maybe neither of us are right. Maybe a combination is right. The part here that where I've seen that when this happens and when we get this right, all have a unifying characteristic. It's when we are collectively engaged. It's when we are all in this together. And we just announced this. There's a letter that the White House just released by the U.S. Chief Technology Officer Megan Smith and Jen Pahlka, the founder here of Code for America, about why all of us need to engage. And that aspect, can we actually put that up on the screen for people who don't know? Like this is this is our letter from the White House with Jennifer Polka about why it's our civic duty to do this. And when we do this collectively, when the team is all engaged and we are all stepping in to serve, as we saw in policing, or we see as we try to push our way into the next generation of healthcare or anything, when we open up the data so everyone works together on it, we get to that experimental frame, because you may come up with something I had never, ever dreamed of because my background or my limitations of my own creativity and experience.
Yeah. Well, I think we're out of time, but what I would take away from this is we've got to start moving from just the notion of open data to the notion of data science, discovery, and that learning cycle that will really get us to better outcomes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you very much, DJ, and thanks for your work at the White House.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.